Hey everyone, and welcome back to the final part of my Mists of Pandaria retrospective. In the past two episodes, we covered the rocky launch and the stellar post-launch support. Today, it is time to wrap things up with patch 5.4, one of the most influential patches ever to be added to the game, and then we'll get to the bottom of just what the hell the legacy of this expansion is. Alright, let's kick it off with 5.4. This is one of the most important patches in Warcraft history. So much of what we see in modern World of Warcraft comes from what the team did here. And while Mists had dabbled in things like treasures and rares and slightly dynamic feeling content with 5.3, this was the patch that would fully realize those ambitions. Interestingly, it might have actually done a better job than any patch since in a few ways. So the Timeless Isle was very well named. The idea was you could just, well, pretty much live there for a while and still have something to do. And while that's not literally true, it was an oddly sticky bit of patch content. Unlike past patch locations, it didn't feature a stack of daily quests, or even a story to take part in. Blizzard's goal was to reintroduce exploration, or at least the feel of it, into the game by cramming the area full of rare mobs, treasures, and events, such that you could go there, start farming up some mobs, and have constant distractions to lead you astray and keep you engaged. The enemy design of this patch was also very different from the rest of the outdoor world, and indeed it's something that they, in my opinion sadly, have not returned to in recent times. The lower area of the island, the lower level, was populated with slightly meaty but mostly simple enemies, but then as you ascended, the enemies got more and more challenging, with more specific mechanics that were, at appropriate gear levels, properly punishing. There was enemies who would raise a shield and do a frontal cone attack. There was enemies who would shield their allies, ones who would spit fire everywhere, ones who would charge at a certain range. Overall, it was a really broad sort of set of mechanics. What this did is it made the gameplay often feel a lot more engaging than just the normal, completely mindless mob grinds that existed in the game. Even though people did eventually work out that killing gulp frogs was the best way to grind the island's currency, timeless coins, but hey, for the most part, lots of good ideas. Now, these coins were used to purchase gear tokens, and you could purchase also a Burden of Eternity, which would upgrade the items that came from those gear tokens to a higher item level. And then the enemies had a chance to drop all of these items, which meant that while you're out there grinding things, there was a very good chance of, some nice luck happening. Now, the coins that I mentioned could be gambled to open loot chests, which of course is something the Blizzard would return to with patch 7.2. And while this all does seem like a big mob grind, there was a certain allure to how it worked. The reward loop was very tightly tuned, and then having various spawns and events to react to that were really quite major, that helped to break up the tedium, especially when, say, the serpent would appear and you'd want to get that mount. Now, the island was also littered with chests of two types. Daily ones, which would have a small reward, and then the one-time only chests that would generously dispense rewards the first time you went to the island. While this did very much feel like a beta and was at times a bit sparse, it had good ideas that really did work. And the sad thing is that they failed to capitalize on this on future iterations such as Tanaan, Broken Shore, and Argus. I think that the core of making a truly fantastic and replayable patch zone is, taking the enemy design, the currency, the rares, the events of the Timeless Isle, and then integrating it with an ideal version of 5.3's content. So something that's got all of those cool exploration elements, but then a lot more dynamic event-driven stuff to sort of keep you going. Now, the Timeless Isle also had something else going for it. Unlike the twisted landscapes of Tanaan, the Broken Shore, or much of Argus, it was just gorgeous. It was inviting, it was serene, it was the type of place that you could go to and just hang out for a lot of time. And I found that the place never got old for me, and there was also no annoying gripes with its design in terms of the geometry. It just worked so damn well. And then even the music was some of the best that Mists had to offer, ranging from a big rousing score to something that was a lot more toned down and serene. In short, the just world design of the area was simply brilliant. Then finally, it was also just packed with lots of cool little things. Getting around the legendary cloak restriction by flying outside the island and gliding down was cool. The gliders in general were cool. Using the seagulls to hitch a ride down to the island. The jumping puzzles, the one where you'd have to glide down and go through the circles in a mini game. Chasing the whale boss, the ghost ship boss. There was just so much flavor and variety crammed in there. In short, The area just felt like it was a passion project from those who created it. Next, let's move on to raiding, because this is the patch that would ultimately bring one of the largest innovations to World of Warcraft raiding ever. Flex mode. Flex mode would allow for raid groups between 10 and 30 players. That's something that we take for granted today, but it was a solution to a few things. First, right, imagine this. It's raid night. 12 people showed up, and you've got to tell 2 of them to, piss off. There's no room for them in the group. Flex pretty much solved that. Second, it also solved a problem for social guilds. They were often caught in a bit of a hard place. So 10 normal didn't really suit them, because sometimes guilds like that, they would have normal mode raiders, maybe 1 or 2 heroic raiders, and then some people who didn't quite fit LFR but didn't fit normal either. So maybe in a 10 normal raid like TOT, you would have 3 underperforming members of the team, and they'd be a big sort of progress roadblock. There just wasn't a difficulty mode there that suited that. Now, this was hard for a lot of social guilds to deal with, and as it turned out, this new, slightly easier flex system, well, okay, a bit more than slightly, would solve this. It was above LFR, so the gameplay was still there, but, it would allow everyone to come along and enjoy raiding. Now, it was still very beta, there were some breakpoints in which fights would be easier based on team size, and Blizzard at the time said that it would not be extended to other difficulty modes, but it obviously was a bit of a resounding success for them. Then an interesting upshot of this is it really helped kick off some add-ons like OQ and sites such as OpenRaid, with the in-game group finder at the time being vastly underdeveloped in comparison to what we've got today. Now, as for Siege of Orgrimmar itself, it was mostly a brilliant raid. Now, I'll admit that I didn't really like the Garrosh fight or the Paragons fight, but for the most part, I had a great time in this raid. For me, it's definitely below the brilliance of Throne of Thunder, but still, it was a solid addition. By the time we hit Siege of Orgrimmar, though, the number situation was getting pretty damn insane, and this was back in the time when WoW was limited by a 32-bit integer. This led to some fun things, such as Garrosh having multiple health bars and phases because they just couldn't give him enough health, supposedly, but the overall number crunching thing, we can leave that to another day. Now, this patch also saw the end of the legendary quest line, and while the RNG currency elements were annoying, the story was quite engaging, and it came to quite a nice conclusion, quickly giving people access to their cloak for the Siege of Orgrimmar raid, which is quite nice. This was great for players who were caught up, but I remember at the time, if you were a little bit behind, grinding out those Mogu Runes of Fate was not exactly the thing you wanted to be doing when Siege was out. One interesting tidbit is that would not happen today as a problem because the raids normally come out 2 months after the core patch content. Now, that really is it for most of this patch's content. As time passed, of course, the patch grew old, like all do. Blizzard brought back some of the item upgrades. They also started doing bonus events where you get more currency and more things like that, all in an effort to retain people. So far, watching this, you must be thinking 5.4 is just the best thing since sliced bread, and in a lot of ways that's fair, but it did have one weakness underneath it all. The story content wasn't really on par of that of 5.1 and 5.2. The end of the legendary questline was kind of satisfying, and the Visions of Time were a pretty neat idea, but by the time we entered 5.4, most of the story was done. Pretty much all we had to do was go in and lop off the head of Garrosh until, well, Varian put an end to that. Now, indeed, much of the key narrative wrapping up of this storyline happened in the War Crimes novel outside of the game, which is kind of unfortunate, as that's the novel that led us directly into Warlords of Draenor. Patch 5.4 also had large implications for class design. Siege of Orgrimmar experimented with this in a few ways. It had some gameplay-altering set bonuses, I remember specifically the Paladin one, which would make it baseline in Warlords, as well as it had some trinkets that were kind of experimental. I think that these earlier experiments in terms of gameplay modifying things are what led to the modern legendary set bonuses and artifact traits. Things, of course, started getting a bit too complex for Blizzard's comfort with this patch, and we eventually saw that lead into the ability prune of Warlords of Draenor. But really, that is it for this patch's contribution, so let's check back in with the subscriber numbers to see how all of this went down. So, when we last checked in with patch 5.2, we just lost another 600k. The following quarter only lost 100k, and the quarter after that, Q4 2013, did something crazy. It had an increase of 200k. Now, as 5.4 grew a bit older, we did see a slow fall off with the next quarter losing 200k, so that's really where we are at the end of Q1 2014. At this stage, patch 5.4 is kind of old, and while it has been announced, Warlords is still a long way off. So the next quarter lost 800k. But interestingly, Q3 brought back 600k. The hype for Warlords, the level 90 boost, and the follow-up patches for 5.4 probably did help quite a bit, even though the pre-expansion event ultimately was a little bit dull. So with all of its content covered, What is the legacy of Mists of Pandaria? This expansion's got a really strange one. It got off to a rocky start, and even as some of the problems were indeed solved, the tone did not always work, and many players flat out just refused it. Based on the theme and the Asian art style, they just didn't like it. For those who stayed though, it was a hell of a time. Mists was, without a shadow of a doubt, the best supported expansion that Blizzard had ever released. They established a tradition of experimentation with the patch content. Each patch brought something different, something new to look forward to, and I think that's a tradition that they've somewhat veered away from as of late, focusing more on the experimentation being in between expansions rather than patches doing that. These days patches are really just sort of small tweaks or updates. Mists of Pandaria also kicked off a more storytelling-focused era of World of Warcraft, with the goal being for WoW to forge its own path, rather than rely on the work done by Warcraft 3. It is an expansion that got a lot of things right, and broke a lot of new ground in so many different areas. Looking back, I think it's fair to say, on paper, that this is one of the best expansions in the game ever, if you didn't bounce off the theme. And that is a humongous if. Certainly, it was quite the move, going away from the traditional, King of the Undead, world-ending dragon to, oh, here's some peace-loving pandas and themes about violence. So it's a bit of a funny one, but there you go. That is it, the retrospective of Mists of Pandaria. How does the expansion go down in your memory? I'd love to hear, so let me know down in the comments. But that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching this series. I hope to do some similar content for other expansions. But with all that said, if you want to support this more long-form sort of content, you can check out the Patreon. Those guys really help out a massive amount. But yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.